Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Hidden Histories Collective. I'm LaChris Robinson Jordan, historian and genealogist. And I'm so glad you're here with us today. We are excited about your presence. We appreciate your presence and all the shares, likes, and comments. You have no idea how energizing that is for us. And I just have to say this up top because, as you all know, this has been a very, very heavy few days. Been a very, very heavy few days. And I debated whether to even drop a video because I didn't want to dishonor any of the energy that was being felt and voiced. But one of the things I learned, or I am learning about all of this in the events of the week, is that knowledge is key to winning this spiritual war. Knowledge is key to winning this spiritual war. And so that is what we do at the Hidden Histories Collective. We are called the Hidden Histories Collective for a reason. We are not here to regurgitate what has been said time and time again. We are here to unearth what is not seen and to offer context and a sense of wholeness or a reality to what we didn't have before. And so I know many people come to the channel and they want to poke holes in things that we say and that we share. And that's totally fine. Again, I have no problem with debate. I have no problem with being quote unquote called out, if you will. One of the things I lead with is knowledge and information. And that is what we will always do here at the Hidden Histories Collective. And that's not to say that everything that we put out is going to be factually correct. I don't think we ever can be 100% factually correct. I definitely know that it takes centuries to learn ourselves. And so it is really difficult to cram centuries of history into a few videos. Our job here is really just to show you what we know and then you go do your research. So that is why, we decided to go ahead and drop a video this week to continue that mission, to continue the legacy, if you will, of our ancestors and continually share information so that we don't walk around ignorant. So here we have it. As you see, the title of our presentation today is America's First Peoples Before 1619. And I use the year 1619 because that often is the year that is referenced when it comes to our quote unquote existence in the Americas. But I wanted to talk about that for a minute. So the last video that we dropped, 1671 book reveals the American Indians, got so much attention. And I loved reading the comments. You guys, I read almost every single comment because it's necessary. And I love having discussions with you and learning more. You guys are incredible with the knowledge that you've been sharing. And that helps me to continually work hard at what we do. So I thank you very much for all of that. And if for those who are visiting us for the first time, please go look at that video because that is the foundation for subsequent videos, including this one. And there are, of course, many people who had opinions against what we were showing. Very, very small percentage. I'd say, maybe 1% of all the people who came to the channel had negative comments. But I want to say before we dive into the presentation is one of the things I'm realizing about debate, since we are on the topic of debate in this country, is that sometimes debates are not going to be played out in public spaces. They're not going to be presented with emotions and diatribes and monologues. They're going to be played out in the courts. And to me, honestly, it being a person who is studying to be a paralegal right now, that is how I move. I don't necessarily believe that, eh, you know, eh, just because you go to a courthouse that it's going to solve everything. No, that's not necessarily true. Yet I will say that most of what we have experienced as a people has had to be played out in the courts. So when we talk about our indigenous status, we talk about our history here in this country, we've often had to resort to legal means to stop the madness. And I just wanted to share with you guys, this is a list of historical legal cases that have actually allowed us to be stronger in our indigenous status and our connection to this land before anyone started shipping us over here, if that's the narrative that we're going to continue to go on, right? Not to say that there weren't Africans and people from other countries coming here and being enslaved. That is true. We understand that. But the narrative around that is so much around that is how we got here. And what we're showing in various cases is that we've been connected to this land for a very, very long time. And I will say it again and again and again as a genealogist that this is your spiritual weapon. And that is what you will have to basically stand on. You don't have to debate people. You don't have to get upset. You don't have to, go off on people. You just say, look, go refer them to Cherokee versus Nash, Davis versus the US. And you will find that most people will retreat because they don't have any information about these legal cases and they're not coming from a legal perspective, but you should always stop having these debates with people and start going to the law, start quoting the law, start talking about genealogy more. That's going to shut a lot of people down. And I was going to save this section for the latter part of the video, but no, I'm going to say this now up front, particularly for the naysayers who want to come onto the channel and create havoc. You will not. We are about learning here, and we are going to talk about it all. No matter how uncomfortable it is for us, we're going to talk about it. So, again, genealogy is going to be your spiritual weapon against those who want to argue and debate as to whether you were here or not here, right? And again, also, there's current legal cases going on right now, particularly with the Geechee heiress property cases in South Carolina and Georgia. That's ongoing. The Reels brothers case is another fascinating case to look up because those brothers actually were imprisoned for a while. And yeah, that's a really deep one. And I'll go over these cases too on the website in the future, as well as in future videos. And then, of course, the Bruce's Beach had a ripple effect, and other cases have sprouted up based on what happened with Bruce's Beach. And there are different organizations that are working towards helping families, particularly whereismyland.org, and other organizations. So yes, I wanted to start the presentation with genealogy being your spiritual weapon against what we have been dealing with in terms of the narrative of the day and having people constantly talk about our enslavement as Africans. So there's that part, and I will always be referencing the law going forward so that we have no issues in debate with people who are not versed in the law. Okay, so let's dive into the presentation and really talk about this. Now, in the last video, we talked about John Ogilby's translation with his book called America, which was published in 1671, and it was called America, being the latest and most accurate description of the New World. Now, as I stated in the last presentation, I'm going to say it here again. The book was a translation and compilation of earlier sources, mostly from the Dutch, the Spanish, and Portuguese accounts. Now, Ogilvy translated and adapted, as well as expanded the original Dutch title by Arnoldus Montanus, and he had published his book in 1671 as well. And he called it, based on the translation, The New and Unknown World, or a description of America and the Southland. So when you read John Ogilvy's 800-page tome, it is partly based on Arnoldus Montanus, his work as well, which his book I think was like 900 plus pages. But I will be having a link to both of the books for you guys to download so that you can see them and you can see the differences. And this video is to show you those differences between the books, or I should say the images that Ogilby did not publish in his book. So there's that part. Now, I want to stress this because it's really, really important because when we talk about translations, but even now, we have to understand that translations are never exact. We know that they're never going to be 100% accurate, and they are going to be based on the editor's perspective. Now, when John Ogilby translated Montanus's work, he expanded it and he drew on at least 30 to 40 travel accounts spanning Spanish, Portuguese, French, Dutch, and English explorers. So what you see in these big expansive books is really an account of many different people, and he compiled his engravings from Debris, Herrera, Benzoni, and others. Plus, he had commissioned artists to redraw or adapt them for his English audience. Now, so some of the engravings were copies of copies, but they always based their work on earlier eyewitness or reported accounts. For those who have any doubt about what Ogilvy's book was, this is how he formed the foundation of his book. Now, in terms of Montanus's sources, he used, similarly to Ogilvy, he's used Spanish chronicles of Cortez, Oviedo, Lopez de Gomara. He also used the Jesuit missionary reports. He used Dutch and Portuguese travel logs. He also used maps and engravings circulating in Amsterdam publishing circles, so things that were already in existence. So when you look at Ogilvy's and Montanus's books, they're basically they have probably 100 plus sources that they have based their books on. So for anybody who's doubting these books are not one man accounts or two man accounts. These are multiple accounts. And they just kept building on the information that they received to make these books. So when you're seeing these 800, 900 page books, that's what you're looking at. Now, I've always said this, particularly as a historian, the knowledge is also in old books. A lot of the reason why we have so much confusion about historical accounts is because a lot of that information from old books has either not been included or has been just not, it's just no one knows it exists. So that is why I started the channel, because I really realized that, oh my goodness, there's so much knowledge in these old books and no one has it, or they've just discounted it. So, but in general, books on early America are found in US libraries all over the country. But particularly when we talk about early America, you can find tons of books on archive.org. I will preach that forever. You're going to find both of these books in the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian Library. The New York Public Library has copies, and there are other books across the world, I should say across the United States, that has these two books in their possession. And I'm also sure that there are people who have this book in their private collections, some of which have been selling for thousands upon thousands of dollars. In addition to the books, I, as a researcher, I'm also a citizen archivist with the U.S. National Archives. So I'm also in the old archives looking at information. And even if you took every American and said, hey, become a citizen archivist, you still would not have enough people to archive and to translate what is in front of them. I mean, it's just so much paper. It's incredible. And they're still scanning. They're still scanning paper. So, but I just want to say that because a lot of people who come to the channel who don't have the knowledge and information is because their high school or maybe even their college was very limited. And for those of us who've attended college, yes, we had access to all these books and access to the old books in the library, but we were more focused on our majors. We didn't even have time to go into the libraries outside of our own core studies. So you could have gone to college and still not have this information. I surely didn't. I didn't have time. I was too focused on being a journalist and writer. So in any case, let's dive into America and talk a little bit about Arnoldus Montanus and his background. He was a Dutch teacher and author, and he published several books on theology, history, and geography. And he also focused on other countries as well, but he was, of course, a Dutch scholar, so he knew a lot about Dutch history. He was all and one thing about his name too, I have to say this, that his last name is a Latinized form of Vanderburg or Van Bergen. I almost was going to just put Arnoldus Vanderburg, but then that might have confused people, so I just went ahead and used the name that history knows him by, as Arnoldus Montanus. And again, he was born in Amsterdam and he studied theology at Leiden University and became a minister in 1653. And as many of you guys know, people who, but at least particularly back in those days, if you were a minister, you were very, very well educated. You had access to books, you had access to old knowledge and information. I can't say what it's like now to be a minister, but back in those days when you were a minister or you had education in theology, it was really based on ancient works and ancient philosophies. And America was Montanus's most famous book. Now, when you guys start reading this, and I didn't explain it in the last video, but I'm going to explain this here. That I want you guys to understand something about how to read the book by Montanus. Now, one of the things to understand is that these engravings reflect how 17th century Europeans imagined the Americas. It wasn't necessarily how indigenous people saw themselves. So that is really, really important to understand that this was a European imagining. It wasn't necessarily the indigenous saying, hey, let me contribute to your book. Hey, let me contribute to my history. Because most of our history at that time was all oral. We didn't have books. We weren't writing books. People were writing much about us, but we weren't necessarily writing about ourselves at that particular time. That didn't come until later. The other thing to also remember about this book is that artists blended fact and fantasy with eyewitness reports, myth, hearsay, and European classical imagery to make the unfamiliar more familiar, right? So, and even having said that, you can still parse out, at least now from modern eyes, what is fact and what was fantasy, because we have more knowledge and information at our fingertips, and we can really say, oh, that probably wasn't true. But at the same time, it's still an amazing foundation for us to understand the Americas. Now, and to my point, despite some of the distortions, the book is still valuable evidence. It preserves details of indigenous presence in cities often erased in later histories. That's why I say you got to stay in those old books. You have to see what hasn't been said or what has been left out to fully understand our history in its totality. Now, I want to talk a little bit about certain sections of the book. I don't, again, this is not a very lengthy video because this book is 900 plus pages and it's hard to decipher everything. But I just picked out like Virginia, for instance. Now, when you see this particular scene, and you guys have probably seen this before floating on the internet, I wanted to explain it a little bit. The scene corresponds to descriptions the Europeans gave of the temples of the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia. are the so-called idols houses, right? So, and I say this, and we have to often imagine it for ourselves. If we were seeing this for the first time, how would we describe what we're seeing? Everything seems so exotic and out of place for us, particularly if we've never been to this country before. We don't know what we're looking at. So some of the imagery that we're seeing here, it's not that it didn't exist, but for many Europeans, it was just brand new for them, incredibly new for them. Now, how this scene is described is they talk about the Virginia deity Okius, whom, at least in the book, he calls the devil Oki, or the chief idol. And I really would love for everyone to do a little bit more study on what these deities meant to the indigenous peoples. Because, like most things, if no one understands why you are putting them in such high regard, they won't know the reason for it and they'll say that it's the devil. Okay. Now, contrary to some early colonial accounts, Oki was not a malevolent or wrathful deity. He was associated with the natural forces, sacred places, and the power that brings life to the world. And if you guys looked at my earlier video, it was Indigenous law is American law. I talked a great deal about spirituality and the spiritual covenants and promises that enter in without even knowing that. We're entering into them the moment that we're born. And so, in order to understand any of the indigenous deities, we must understand how they revered Mother Nature and how sacrifice and all of those things tie into how they perceived to move forward in life or how to survive. They had to pay homage to those who had created them. But I just wanted to introduce this in particular because I want people to not necessarily, I don't want people to be thinking that indigenous religion or any form of the indigenous religions were all about deities and sacrifice. I think it's so important that when we look at and we read this book in particular, that we really look at it from and through the lens of the indigenous peoples. But you have to first study them, study their culture and way of life before you can make a lot of judgments. But that's what a lot of colonial Europeans did when they first came here. They didn't understand it. So I get it. Now, one of the things, the reason why I choose Virginia, because Virginia is so important to our indigenous history. And what we do know is that archaeology, as well as oral history, confirms that these sacred houses once stood across Tidewater, Virginia, what the region we know to be Tidewater, Virginia. And you will see all these different indigenous nations that resided in those areas. Now, Tidewater includes the coastal region of Virginia, which encompasses the eastern areas along the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. And if you guys haven't had the opportunity, please go look at the video the interview that we did with Lisa Cypress of the Alkamaak Nation. She had so much insightful information and so much history that she presented there. And she tells you about her people, and of course, people who look at her and see her on the street will think, oh, she's African American or she's Black. But she's not. She's an Accomack Indian. And so go please look at her video as well. I will be creating a link to that in the description too, so that you guys can learn more about her peoples and learn more about, yes, to dispel a lot of the myths around what a quote unquote indigenous person looks like. So, but I want to just focus on Virginia for a little bit. Um, Now I put these two maps together because I want you guys to see how Virginia looked in the indigenous days with all the nations and what it looks like now. And as you can see, there are still some, hopefully it's a clear map. You can see how some of the townships correspond to the nations. Okay. The other thing about Virginia I want to notice is that I want you guys to look at the dress and how they drew the Indigenous. Now, the Powhatan and neighboring Algonquin peoples did wear feather mantles and deerskin cloaks. They did in ceremony. But the stylization here with the face mask, garment, and the semi classical posing is total artistic license. I have to say that it's a total artistic license. And when I talk about the semi classical posing, that is what you often saw in Greek and Roman statues as well. But when Ogilvy and Montanus put these books together, they knew who their audience was, and so they tried to conform, at least in that sense, so that there was some familiarity. Very interesting here. Now, one of the things that Montanus and his publisher, Jacob Van Meers, wanted was Europeans to see Virginia's Aboriginals as both exotic and noble. And that reinforced the idea of America as a strange, untamed, and worthy of conquest and study. So this book wasn't for the average person, it was for the elite. I want to stress that and reiterate that, like I did in the last video, was that these books were for scholars, they were for institutions of higher learning, they were for the monarchs and the elite. It wasn't for the everyday person. Yeah. So the other bit of artistic license that we see here is you see the men on the left, they're wearing togas. Now, that wasn't a literal depiction of indigenous peoples. We weren't wearing togas, not as we know togas to be worn by the Romans and the Greeks. These were purely European inventions. And why they did this was this was an attempt to, at least from my perspective, add dignity to the scene by dressing American chiefs in the garb of Roman senators. And what I mean by dignity, that's not to say that we didn't have our dignity, but we certainly weren't dressing for Europeans. We were dressing for very specific reasons. And if you look at enough of indigenous drawings, we had our ceremonial dress, we had our everyday dress, and we had dress for everything, just like we do now. Like, we dress a certain way when we're working, we dress a certain way when we're playing, we dress a certain way when we are formal. So there's different forms of dress, but they the European didn't always know how to draw us in various ways. So if they saw us dressing, or if they ever the descriptions was us in our just wearing our undergarments, if you will, they wanted to show us indignity, but we were already dignified. It was dignity to us. So that is why Montanus and his engravers framed America through a European lens, and so they mixed the togas and the feathers, which is part history, part propaganda. That's why it's so important to really, really know indigenous history, at least early America, so that we can understand these images. Now, the other section of the book that I love is Florida. Now, this quote unquote giant is not a literal ethnographic portrait, it's a visual allegory that Europeans sometimes ascribe to Florida's peoples. But keep in mind something, there were many indigenous people who were what we would deem unusually tall living in the Southeast, but not just the Southeast. There's, yes, various accounts of giants and giant skeletons, what have you. And when you look at this particular engraving, he is on a platform, if you will. So he looks like he's super tall anyway. But yes, this is fascinating to see. And here are some other images for you guys to see that are in the book. Lots revealed here. As you can see, there were relationships, building alliances, but they had really no idea what was about to happen in the future. And this is a scene of what some would say is a sacrifice. But I put this here deliberately so that people would go do research on this because there's more to the image than meets the eye. Here's another image of an Indigenous person here. Again, you see the Roman and Greek stylized posing. I highly doubt that we were posing like that. And this is a war scene. Now, in the last video, I also showed this engraving. It's called Nova Mexico, and I wanted to show it again here to show you the vastness of the cities. And many of these cities, Nova Mexico being translated as New Mexico, but really expanded. The New Mexico wasn't the New Mexico territory we know today. The Nova Mexico was really the Southwest Territory. And those areas were designed, built, and maintained by indigenous peoples. And they had stone temples, palaces, marketplaces, et cetera, et cetera. And that's been proven. I just wanted to show you the engravings here. Now, I want to speak a little bit about, yes, indigenous cities before the conquest, because we have to know that the evidence is right in front of our face still. And Chaco Canyon in New Mexico is, in just going to the Southwest in general, will give you so much information because everything is still intact, not as it necessarily might have looked like back in the ancient times, but you could see a bit of the structures here. Now, remember, again, these were not European cities, but indigenous ones. And we also know that there was a lot of repurposing, destruction, rebuilding, all of that. The Spaniard and the European in general just took everything they could and just made it their own, if you will. But the one thing that I want to stress is that these books preserve what the conquerors themselves first saw. I think that's really, really important is that when you read these books, or you go into these old books and what have you, you can see, and some of what they saw still coincides with what we're seeing today. And that many of these civilizations were as advanced as any in Europe. Now, of course, this flies in the face of convention for many people, but these cities were conquered and they were erased and they were rebuilt by the indigenous upon the orders of the Europeans. We have to admit that we were doing the rebuilding based on their orders, which is wild. We're having to rebuild our own cities in the European way. And one of the most stark ways was here in Cholula near Puebla, Mexico. Now, this is an archival photo of a church that is on top of a pyramid. And every time I see this, and when I first discovered it, it really did something to my soul. And the Spanish term for the church is Nuestra Senora de los Remedios. And in English, it is called Our Lady of Remedies. And it's located in Cholula, Mexico. Literally, it's a church built on top of a pyramid. Now, when you see it from an aerial perspective, you can see the vastness of the pyramid. And it's the largest pyramid by volume in the world. It's incredible. So when the Spaniards built the church or had the indigenous built the church, rebuild this church, I'm sure it did something to their soul because it does something to mine to see it. Now, it's connected to a story that many of you, I would love for you to go do your research on, It was called the Cholula Massacre in 1519, and Hernan Cortez ordered the pyramids temple dismantled. So go read more on the Cholula Massacre. I would talk about it some more here, but we don't have a lot of time often, but I will talk about it one day. But right now, it's sometimes too heavy on the soul to talk about. But in 1594, the Church of Our Lady of Remedies was built on the flattened top of the pyramid. And as you can see in the right hand corner, you can still see a grand portion of that temple. And when this temple, when this church was built, it was really the Spaniards' way of saying, yes, we conquered you. And so to the Spanish, it marked Christian victory, but to the indigenous memory, it was the covering over of their sacred mountain and temple. Now, I'm going to be really honest here and say what is real and speak to the elephant in the room. We were part of our own demise because we fought each other. The Spaniards could not have conquered us without our help and the help of our enemies that looked like us. So it was a lot of different nations and Indians and other territories that banded together because they were against the Aztecs. And there's a whole nother history there. But I just had to say it out loud that, you know, even in terms of the Indian wars that were fought in North America, those wars lasted so long because we were fighting each other. Yes, they were orchestrated very much so by the colonists. The colonists kept us fighting. They created dynamics to keep us fighting. That was their policy. As I've mentioned in previous videos, it was their policy to keep us fighting with one another because if we stopped fighting, then we'd be looking at them next. Which some of us understood that and fought so hard. But this was just an example of how our cities were rebuilt, but also rebuilt just to diminish us. So, but we're coming to the end of this video, and I wanted to say this before we end here, and I want to go back to genealogy. I want to circle back to genealogy. Now, again, part of our fight is going to be legal. Let's just be real with it, because I'm not going to sit in the middle of a street and keep debating someone. I'm going to talk about this in a more formalized manner. So, for many of you, your legal paper trail began yesterday and the day before. And some of you are already family historians and genealogists, and that's a beautiful thing. But that's how you frame this. You are a family historian. Now, when you call yourself a genealogist, it's a little bit more detailed or a lot more detailed because now you're using very scientific methods to prove and show connections. And even though you don't necessarily need a degree in genealogy to be bona fide, you do need board certification to say, yes, I'm a bona fide genealogist. Okay. And so one of the biggest things that you can do, irrespective of what you call yourself, what title you have, collect those vital records, birth, marriage, and death certificates, get those census and enrollment rolls, land and property records, probate and court documents. There's so much you can do. And a lot of these ancestry sites have that information already. That's why it always perplexes me why people aren't getting those documents, why genealogy is not imperative for them, why they don't see the need. Yes, it's a lot of work, but somebody has to do it. So, um, yes, to think about the current legal cases, you have to also remember that part of the reason why we're able to win these legal cases is because we had treaty and legal agreements. And if your ancestors were freedmen of the five tribes, You have the Treaty of 1866, which had provisions in it. That's why they were able to circle back to the treaty, because that was a legal document too. So part of winning your legal cases means that you have to go back in time. And you're also going back to your family Bibles, you're going to church records, community and oral accounts. And I will stress that oral histories that's everything, because your oral histories are going to tie you back to the recorded history. And sometimes that the oral history fills in the gaps or vice versa. Okay. And right now, organize and prepare. Don't wait for a legal case, because one day you might have one. You just don't know. So you want to prepare a genealogy binder or shared digital archive by family line. And when I say shared, I mean this must be available to your other family members too. Somebody has to carry the torch, carry the mantle. And I have people in my family who will carry the torch. I'm not going to be doing it all by myself, that's for sure. And they're doing their research as well. And of course it changes. Life gets in the way, and people become ill, or they just have other things that are pressing on them. And so sometimes there's going to be gaps in the research. There's going to be moments where you just don't have time to do the work. But someone has to do it or take the mantle or know that I'll pick it up after you do. Now, all these cases that I referred to at the top of the video were cases that took decades. It took decades in some cases, or it took a couple of, you know, uh, years, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, these are really heavy duty cases, because you're talking about your opponent who is resistant to your claim. So you have to account for that as well. So, but in essence, back up everything back up all your documents in at least two places. And if you can, make sure that you have paper copies of this, which means, yes, you may use a lot of ink to print these documents, but ultimately in the end, you'll need to have these in some kind of organized fashion if you're talking about establishing a legal case. So, that is the end of the presentation for today. I hope this was helpful for many of you and really solidified your place in early America, as it should. And thank you all so much for listening, for watching. That's amazing. We hope that you guys sign up for our newsletter on the Hidden Histories Collective website. We will be sending that out, and it will have so much information in it for you that we just don't have the space for here on the channel. But it's like a supplement to what we are doing here. And so, if you want more information from us and to help you on your own genealogy journey, there's going to be so much on the side that's going to be helpful for you. We encourage you to sign up. Thank you so much for listening. We will be talking to you guys real soon. So stay focused, stay vigilant, and stay informed. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you.